I come from a place which is, already has some international dimensions, but of a rather sinister sort.
I'm joined here today by longtime friend and mentor, Professor Tim Barrett, who was a professor of Chinese religions at SOAS before his retirement. And he has published and continues to publish a staggering amount of research, not only on Chinese religions such as Taoism and Buddhism and even Christianity, but also on a surprising range of other topics related to Asian history, but also about our perception or the development of our perception of Asian history. So Tim,
Yep.
Thank you for agreeing to do this interview with me, or just discussion, just this talk.
Okay.
And I just wanted to ask you about your research maybe now.
Mm-hmm.
What are you working on?
Okay. As you may know, I have a main field of work is with mainly Buddhist sources, because that's what I was asked to do when I was an undergraduate here. Go to America, learn how to read Buddhist sources. It'll be useful for the Tang dynasty. The Tang dynasty was big in those days in Cambridge. So that's what I did, and that's what I do. But I've always been interested in, as a hobby, rather than, fishing or anything else. I like to read early sinology and try and grasp how the subject developed in this country, and partly it's practical. What is inside my students' heads when they come to be taught, to try and figure out what's the image of China that has built up in this country over the past 200 years. Doesn't go back much further than that, because say 250 years ago, this country was largely dependent on sources in French, and they assumed that they were lying.
Okay.
It's one thing that I, obviously being put into religious studies, although I started off amongst historians and still consider myself a sort of historian, I tend to take a religious studies view, even of the context I'm working in, and I've come to realise how sectarian Anglo-Saxon sinology certainly was, and that tensions with Catholic Europe are absolutely basic to the way that the study of China developed.
So do you feel the repercussions or the results of this sectarianism today?
Yes, because it's part of the insularity and xenophobia, which goes back to obviously to the Reformation, but even considered as a Reformation as a largely sort of North European phenomenon, the insularity of Britain makes it more intense, and also the poverty of Britain, which means, for example, that when I'm explaining to people in Hong Kong the development of the translation of Buddhist texts, I have to go back to Tudors and Stuarts and explain that, for example, the beginning of the involvement of the British in South and East Asia was largely to do with the fact that, being a very poor country, at the start of the Reformation and modernity, there was not much of a standing navy, and so violence was subcontracted to individuals technically through letters of marque that allowed them to be privateers. When I was a boy in Bristol, I used to spend time in the museum. One of the things that impressed me and made me interested in Chinese and civilization was the Schiller collection of Chinese antiques, wonderful celadon and so forth. But there were also a large number of ship models, since Bristol was an important port, especially for slavery and so forth. And a lot of the ship models, it said privateer. And what that meant is that these guys were licensed pirates, basically. So the first English in South and East Asian waters were really licensed pirates, licensed to go after Spanish treasure. And unfortunately, we weren't very good at that because the Dutch ran us out of all the best places. Protestants as well, but smarter, I think.
But you talk about the poverty of England, but surely, I mean, like the 19th century or something. About the British Empire, it's not.
Okay, eventually. I mean, when we settled down to this wonderful invention, the triangle based on Bristol, where you take out beads to Africa, get slaves, send them out to the West Indies and bring back sugar. They had it made. So yes, you'll know there's a lot of discussion now about how the 19th century prosperity was built on 18th century development of slavery and slave trading, going back into the 17th century. You'll remember there was a famous incident recently where we tore down in Bristol the statue of a benefactor of the city who was actually a slave trader. I can remember, would have been about 2018 or something like that, not long before the clampdown, the pandemic. I had a friend who's Hawaiian Japanese, and going and looking at the statue, I said, here's old Edward Colston, and there should be a plaque on it somewhere saying that he was actually a slave trader. I walked around the thing twice, absolutely no word about it, because the people who had set up the statue were blocking that. They did change the name on the large auditorium in Bristol, which had his name on when I was young. So they did change that, but they wouldn't change the statue. So I come from a place which is, already has some international dimensions, but of a rather sinister sort. So I guess, I was always prepared to re-examine the history, not simply of, the Tang, which is a fairly safe topic, because no Brits were actually involved. In fact, the first person from the British Isles to be involved in China, and I hope it's not a big deal, but I hope to mention this when I published the lectures I gave in Hong Kong, was actually Irish. You may know the name of Odorico of Pordenone, who came after Marco Polo in the next century, but he seems to have been. He's got descriptions of Hangzhou, and a very interesting description of the monkeys of Hangzhou that Meir Shahar has written about. And the reason why I wanted to talk about that was I wanted to talk about how interactions with animals are important in the initial crossing of cultural boundaries, and that's why Jatakas are important, because there's so many animal stories. But anyhow, this guy had an Irish sidekick, so called Seamus or Jacobus de Hiberniae, who is just like a silent partner, but occasionally you find a bit of an Irish legend in this travelogue. The Tang is good for it's not based on British slavery, and one can research it with a clear conscience. But I've also felt that I want to find out where, what is the intellectual tradition that I am part of. And initially I was just interested in who were the professors in Cambridge. And initially I just assumed that when you start Chinese studies, you're starting in a field of academic research that has a decent history, and names like great French scholars, and you kind of assume that that's how it always was, back to Ricci and so on and so forth. But in fact, in Britain, it's very, very shaky. Yes, Cambridge University would put up. They would take Thomas Wade's books, but not pay him. They would give some money to Giles, but Giles did very little in the way of teaching. Although, what was the name of his most interesting student? Actually became an anthropologist of the Mongols. Her name is Lindgren Utsi. She became eventually a fellow of Lucy Cavendish, and that's where I had to go to find the details about her life. She learned some Chinese from Giles and then started doing anthropological research in Mongolia. Her name, Lindgren Utsi, the consequence of marrying a Lap reindeer herder. Wow. And being the first person to introduce reindeer herding to Scotland. So, some successes for the Chinese studies program here before the 1940s and the arrival of Halone and so forth, and also the old clergyman A.C. Moule. Not bad if you look at his stuff. Never set out to be a professor of Chinese. He just happened to be vicar of Trumpington and had been brought up in China, knew Chinese. Pelliot collaborated with him because Pelliot had not been brought up in Hangzhou as a child, but Moule knew the place backwards but could also read the sources of the place. So that was an accidental success for Cambridge, but really thereafter it's due to people like Halone and so forth who set things up. And then there was expansion in the late 1940s that was quite successful because a whole bunch of people had been made to learn Japanese during the war, and so a certain fraction of them became interested in East Asia as a whole. So you got Dennis Twitchett, Michael Lowy, and before that the Canadian Ted Pulley-Blank, who originally started doing intelligence work on Italy, but since Italy was out of the war fairly early, he got a chance to do something else, so they switched him to Japanese and so on and so forth. It's
so all of these people actually, like Michael Lowy, even David McMullen, right? They
went through military training.
Yes, they were learning Japanese.
No, David's twin brother learned Japanese, okay. but what happened? Initially they were learning Japanese in the 40s, then switched to Chinese in some cases. Angus Graham would be another, but come 49 and the onset of the Cold War in East Asia, a certain number, because we had conscription in those days, national service, military service. So the guys who looked as if they could cope with it were given Chinese to learn. Not everybody did, because if you were thought politically unsuitable, you were banned from it. That happened in the case of Martin Bernal. Do you know the name? No. He only wrote one book on Chinese socialism to 1905 before becoming interested in African influences on the classical world, and he wrote a book called Black Athena, which might ring a faint bell. Check it out. The philology is a bit off, but it's done with great verve. But he was also a good teacher of modern Chinese history, but he had been, because he came from a quite left-wing background, he was not allowed to study Chinese in the Royal Air Force.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, actually, our time is kind of up.
So we're only starting.
Yes. We should definitely schedule a longer.
Okay, we can do
absolutely,
that.
Because this is fascinating.
Yeah.
So, I've been here for over 10 years, and I'm learning about the history of Cambridge.
Well, I have been working on it for since I was at Cambridge. And I'll send you. I'll send you something.
Thank you. Thank you.
Which gives the national picture and maybe something of the basic national disaster that happens with Chinese stuff. So, yeah, we'll call the others in and do something else.
Yeah, okay.
Might I sit quietly in a corner?
Yes. So thank you so much for
we'll come back
talking.
to this.
And this will be the trailer.
For something really big.
Yes. Thank you.
Right, okay. It'll be epic.
Yes.